The wind carried nothing but dust and memories across the barren stretch of land that Clara Boone called home. She stood at the edge of her property, one hand shading her eyes against the relentless sun, watching the horizon where the earth met the sky in a wavering line of heat. 3 years had passed since she'd buried Samuel beneath the lone cottonwood tree behind the house. 3 years of waking to silence where once there had been the comforting sounds of another soul sharing her life. Dusty Hollow lay 5 miles to the east, a collection of weathered buildings that barely qualified as a town. Clara made the journey once a month for supplies, enduring the pitying looks of the townswomen and the calculating stares of men who saw a young widow as either prey or opportunity. At 26, she was still considered handsome, despite the sun's harsh treatment of her fair skin and the permanent squint that came from years of prairie living. The small homestead Samuel had built with his own hands was all she had left of him. 4 rooms cobbled together from rough-hewn timber, a leaking roof that needed constant attention, and 40 acres of land that fought her every attempt at cultivation. The drought had been particularly cruel this year, turning her modest vegetable garden into withered stalks that rattled like bones in the evening breeze. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked back to the house. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, highlighting the patches where grass refused to grow. She paused at the water pump, working the handle until a thin stream of brackish water filled her bucket. Everything out here required effort, demanded payment in sweat and determination. Inside the house, she moved through her evening routine with practiced efficiency. Light the oil lamp, check the supplies in the pantry. Count the remaining coins in the tin box hidden behind the loose board in the bedroom wall. $17.32. Enough to last another month if she was careful. Maybe 2 if she could trade some preserves for flour at Morton's store. She sat at the rough wooden table and opened Samuel's Bible, the one possession of his she couldn't bear to sell despite the offers from traveling preachers. His notes filled the margins in cramped handwriting. Observations about scripture mixed with mundane reminders about planting seasons and horse remedies. Clara traced her finger over the words, remembering how he'd read aloud to her in the evenings, his voice deep and certain. Samuel had been a good man, perhaps too good for this harsh country. He'd come west with dreams of building something lasting, of raising children who would inherit more than poverty and struggle. Instead, he died defending their meager savings from a group of drifters who decided a lonely homestead was easy pickings. Clara had found him in the doorway, his rifle still clutched in his hands. 3 men dead in the yard. The 4th had gotten away with $12 and Samuel's life. The memory still woke her some nights, the image of blood seeping into the floorboards she'd scrubbed raw but could never quite clean. She'd learned to shoot after that, practicing until her hands stopped shaking and her aim turned true. The Winchester rifle now rested within easy reach beside the door, loaded and ready. As darkness crept across the prairie, Clara prepared her simple supper of cornbread and beans. She'd killed the last chicken 2 weeks ago when the Henderson boy had taken fever and his mother needed broth. It was what neighbors did out here, shared what little they had because tomorrow it might be you needing help. But the Hendersons lived 8 miles north, and days could pass without Clara seeing another soul. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Not the physical labor or the constant worry about money, but the crushing weight of silence that pressed against her chest each night. She'd taken to talking to herself just to hear a human voice, carrying on conversations with Samuel's ghost or the horses in the barn. The 2 mares were good listeners, patient with her tears and never judging her moments of weakness. Clara had been raised properly back in Missouri, taught to embroider and play piano, skills that served no purpose in a place where survival trumped all social graces. Her mother had wept when she'd announced her intention to marry Samuel and head west. "You'll die out there," she'd said, clutching Clara's hands. "That wilderness swallows proper women whole." Perhaps her mother had been right. The Clara who'd arrived in Dusty Hollow 6 years ago, bright-eyed and full of hope, bore little resemblance to the woman she'd become. Her hands, once soft and white, were now calloused and scarred. Her hair, which Samuel had loved to brush each night, stayed bound in a tight bun to keep it from the constant wind. She'd traded silk dresses for practical calico and learned that dignity meant less than staying alive. Still, she endured. It was what women did out here, what they'd always done. They buried husbands and children, faced drought and disease, and somehow found the strength to wake each morning and begin again. Clara had no illusions about her future. She would work this land until it killed her, or she grew too old to continue. There would be no children to carry on. No legacy beyond a name on a wooden cross that would eventually rot away. The coyotes began their nightly chorus as Clara cleaned her dishes in the basin. Their howls echoed across the emptiness, wild and mournful. She secured the shutters and checked the door bolt, habits born of necessity. Out here, danger came in many forms: animals, weather, and men who'd forgotten what civilization meant. Before bed, she knelt beside Samuel's grave, pulling the weeds that constantly tried to reclaim the small cleared space. The wooden marker had already begun to weather, his name fading despite her efforts to maintain it. "I'm still here," she whispered to the mound of earth. "Still fighting, just like you wanted." The stars emerged one by one in the vast prairie sky, so many and so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Clara stood and gazed upward, feeling impossibly small beneath their ancient light. Somewhere beyond those stars, perhaps Samuel watched over her. The thought brought little comfort but helped it ease the ache that never quite left her chest. Tomorrow would bring more of the same: water to haul, animals to tend, the endless battle against a land that seemed determined to reclaim every human mark upon it. But tonight Clara allowed herself a moment of grief for the life that might have been, for the children who would never play in the yard, for the man whose laughter once filled these empty rooms. She was a widow at the edge of the world, holding on with bleeding fingers to a dream that had died with a good man's last breath. And tomorrow, she would wake and do it all again, because that was what the living did. They continued long after hope had faded, driven by nothing more than the stubborn refusal to surrender. The storm rolled in from the west that afternoon, bringing with it the peculiar yellow-gray light that turned the familiar landscape strange and threatening. Clara hurried to secure the shutters as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, mixing with the ever-present dust to create mud that would cake everything it touched. The horses whinnied nervously in the barn, sensing the electricity in the air. She was crossing the yard to check their water when she saw him, a dark shape slumped against the side of the barn, barely visible through the increasing downpour. At first, Clara thought it might be a trick of the light, or perhaps a coyote seeking shelter. But as she drew closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, she recognized the unmistakable form of a man. He lay face down in the mud, one arm stretched toward the barn door as if he'd been trying to reach shelter when his strength gave out. His clothes were caked with dirt and something darker that Clara's experienced eye recognized as blood. A lot of blood. She stood frozen for a moment, rain streaming down her face, every instinct screaming at her to run back to the house and bar the door. But then he moved, just slightly, a shuddering breath that lifted his shoulders, and Clara found herself kneeling beside him despite her better judgment. She'd seen enough death to recognize when it was circling close, and something in her rebelled against letting it claim another victim on her land, even a stranger who might bring nothing but trouble. "Mister!" she had to shout over the wind and rain. "Can you hear me?" No response beyond another labored breath. Clara gritted her teeth and grabbed his shoulder, using all her strength to turn him over. The man was heavy, solid muscle beneath the torn shirt, and it took several attempts before she managed to roll him onto his back. What she saw made her suck in a sharp breath. He'd been shot, at least twice from what she could tell. One wound in his left shoulder still seeped blood, while another along his ribs had torn through his shirt and left an angry furrow in the flesh. His face was angular and weathered, probably somewhere in his 30s, with several days' worth of beard and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. This was no farmer or rancher. Everything about him, from the well-oiled gun belt at his hip to the quality of his boots beneath the mud, spoke of a man who lived by violence, the kind of man Samuel had always warned her about, the kind who brought death trailing behind them like a loyal dog. Clara glanced toward the house, then back at the stranger. The Christian thing would be to help him. The smart thing would be to let the storm take him and pretend she'd never seen him at all. But as she watched the rain wash the blood from his wounds in pink rivulets, she thought of Samuel dying alone in their doorway, and made her choice. "Lord, forgive me for whatever comes of this," she muttered, then began the arduous process of dragging him into the barn. It took nearly 20 minutes to move him the 30 feet to shelter. Clara's dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin, and her arms shook with the effort by the time she managed to pull him inside. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls, eyes rolling at the scent of blood and stranger. She left him lying on the packed earth floor while she fetched supplies from the house. Clean rags, the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes, Samuel's old straight razor, and the needle and thread she used for mending. Her hands were steady as she gathered what she needed, but her mind raced. Who was this man? Who had shot him? And more importantly, who might come looking for him? Back in the barn, she lit a lantern and hung it from a nail, casting flickering shadows across the stranger's still form. In the better light, she could see more details. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun, the calluses on his gun hand, the way his fingers had instinctively curled near his holster even in unconsciousness. Clara had helped Samuel doctor injured animals and had tended her share of wounds, but she'd never worked on injuries this severe. She cut away his shirt with the razor, exposing a torso marked by old scars and new damage. The shoulder wound was the worst, still bleeding steadily. She could see the hole where the bullet had entered, but couldn't tell if it had passed through or lodged inside. She poured whiskey over the wounds, and the stranger's body convulsed. His eyes snapped open, gray as the storm clouds outside, and his hand moved lightning quick to grasp her wrist. Clara found herself staring into eyes that held no warmth, only the flat assessment of a predator deciding if she was threat or prey. "Easy," she said, surprised her voice came out steady. "I'm trying to help." Those gray eyes studied her for a long moment before the grip on her wrist loosened. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak emerged. Clara reached for the water bucket, supporting his head as she helped him drink. When he'd swallowed a few sips, he managed to rasp out a single word. "Posse?" "No posse," Clara said. "Just me and the storm." He processed this information, then gave an almost imperceptible nod before closing his eyes again. He didn't lose consciousness entirely. She could tell by the tension in his body, the way his hand stayed near his gun, but he allowed her to continue working. The shoulder wound proved as bad as she'd feared. The bullet was still in there, lodged deep in the muscle. Clara had watched Samuel dig shot out of horses, but this was different. Still, leaving it inside would mean certain death from infection. She poured whiskey on the razor and tried not to think about what she was about to do. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "Do it," he growled through clenched teeth. Clara had to dig deep, following the wound channel while the stranger's body went rigid with pain. He never cried out, though she could see the muscles in his jaw working as he ground his teeth. When she finally found the bullet and worked it free, he let out a long breath that might have been relief. She cleaned and bound both wounds as best she could, tearing strips from her petticoat when she ran out of clean rags. By the time she finished, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving only steady rain drumming on the barn roof. The stranger had drifted into something between sleep and unconsciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. Clara sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. Blood stained her hands and dress, and she knew she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd saved a man who was almost certainly an outlaw, brought danger literally to her doorstep, but looking at him lying there, reduced to mere flesh and blood like any other man, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She covered him with an old horse blanket and prepared to keep vigil through the night. Tomorrow would bring new problems. How to hide him if anyone came looking. How to explain his presence if discovered. What to do when he recovered enough to be dangerous again. But tonight she'd done what her conscience demanded, even if her common sense protested. As she settled onto a hay bale to watch over him, Clara noticed his gun belt more closely. The holster was tied down in the fashion of men who lived by their quick draw, and the gun itself was a Colt .45, well-maintained and deadly. Everything about this man whispered danger, from his scarred face to his unconscious wariness. "What have I done?" she asked the darkness. But no answer came except the stranger's labored breathing and the gentle sounds of the horses settling for the night. She'd saved a life tonight, but at what cost? Only time would tell if her act of mercy would prove to be salvation or damnation. Either way, Clara Boone's isolated existence had just become considerably more complicated, and the morning would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. The first 3 days passed in a blur of fever and vigilance. Clara divided her time between the house and the barn, carrying broth and fresh bandages while trying to maintain the appearance of normal routine. The stranger, he'd given no name and she hadn't asked, drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting infection with a tenacity that spoke of a man well acquainted with survival. She'd moved him to a corner of the barn behind stacked hay bales, creating a makeshift hiding place that would escape casual inspection. Each morning before dawn, she'd check his wounds, clean them with whiskey that made him hiss through clenched teeth, and force water down his throat. He submitted to her ministrations with wary acceptance, those gray eyes tracking her movements even when fever clouded his mind. On the 4th day, she found him sitting up, his back against the barn wall and his gun in his lap. The fever had broken during the night, leaving him pale but alert. When Clara entered with his morning meal, he watched her approach with the focused attention of a hawk. "You should be lying down," she said, setting the bowl of porridge beside him. "Can't afford to," he replied, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "How long?" "4 days. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that he'd been vulnerable for so long. His fingers tightened on the gun before deliberately relaxing. "Anyone come by?" "No." Clara poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "But that won't last. The Henderson boy usually rides over once a week to see if I need anything from town." The stranger absorbed this information, then struggled to his feet despite Clara's protest. He swayed slightly but remained upright through sheer will. "I need to move on." "You need to heal," Clara countered. "Those wounds aren't nearly closed. You start riding now, you'll be dead before you make 5 miles. "Better than bringing trouble to your door." He took an unsteady step toward his saddle, which Clara had cleaned and stored in the corner. "Trouble's already here," she said flatly. "Sit down before you fall down." For a moment, they stared at each other, the widow who'd seen too much death and the outlaw who dealt in it. Then his legs gave out, and he slumped back against the wall with a muttered curse. Clara resisted the urge to say she'd told him so, instead kneeling to check the bandage on his ribs. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why help me?" Clara continued her examination, noting with satisfaction that the wound was healing cleanly. "Would you prefer I'd left you to die in the mud?" "Most would have. Smart ones anyway." "Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought," she admitted, sitting back on her heels. "What's your name? I can't keep calling you Mr. in my head." He hesitated then. "Elias Kane." The name meant nothing to her, though she suspected it would to any lawman within 100 miles. "Well, Mr. Kane, you're going to need at least another week before you can sit a horse without falling off. Can you stay hidden that long?" "Done it before." He studied her with those unsettling eyes. "What about you? You ready to lie when someone comes asking questions?" Clara thought of Samuel, of his insistence on always telling the truth. But Samuel had never harbored a wounded outlaw in their barn. "I've done harder things than lie." Over the following days, they developed an uneasy routine. Clara would tend his wounds morning and evening, bringing food and water while maintaining her normal chores. Elias proved to be a difficult patient, restless, suspicious of every sound, hand never far from his weapon. But he was also surprisingly courteous, always thanking her for the food, careful to keep appropriate distance between them. She learned things about him through observation rather than conversation. The way he automatically checked sight lines whenever she opened the barn door, how he slept so lightly that the slightest unusual sound brought him fully awake, the methodical way he cleaned and checked his weapons, movements practiced from countless repetitions. But there were other things too, glimpses of the man beneath the gunfighter's facade. She caught him talking softly to her horses, his voice gentler than she'd heard it. Once she found him carving a piece of wood with his knife, shaping what looked like a toy horse before he noticed her and quickly pocketed it. And sometimes, when the fever dreams took him, he called out a name. Annie. Clara didn't ask about Annie. She'd learned that questions were unwelcome, that Elias Kane shared nothing he didn't choose to share. But she wondered about the woman who could put such anguish in a hard man's voice. The close quarters of their arrangement created a strange intimacy. Clara became familiar with the scars mapping his body, knife wounds, bullet holes, marks of a violent life. He, in turn, saw her at her most unguarded, hair unbound in the early morning, the weariness she couldn't quite hide after a long day's work, the moments when grief for Samuel overwhelmed her careful composure. One evening, as she changed his bandages, Elias broke their usual silence. "Your husband, how long ago?" "3 years," Clara replied, surprised by the question. "How?" "Men came looking for easy money. Samuel gave them lead instead." She kept her voice steady through long practice. "He took 3 of them with him." Elias nodded slowly. "He died protecting what was his. Good death as they go." "There are no good deaths," Clara said sharply. "Just final ones." "You're wrong there, Mrs. Boone. I've seen plenty of bad deaths. Your man's wasn't one of them." Clara finished tying off the bandage, unsure how to respond to what might have been comfort from a man who dealt death like others dealt cards. As Elias grew stronger, the danger of discovery increased. He could now move around the barn, though Clara insisted he stay hidden during daylight hours. She'd catch him doing exercises to rebuild his strength, slow, careful movements that made sweat bead on his forehead, but which he completed with grim determination. The promised visit from the Henderson boy came on the 10th day. Clara met him in the yard, heart pounding as she accepted his offer to fetch supplies from town. She managed to appear normal, even chatting about the weather and his mother's health, all while acutely aware of the armed man hiding not 50 feet away. After the boy left, she found Elias standing just inside the barn door, gun drawn and ready. "You did good," he said, holstering the weapon. "Natural as anything. I don't like lying to that boy. He's been nothing but kind to me. Better than getting him killed for knowing too much." Elias's voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps regret for the life that made such calculations necessary. That night, word came with the supplies from town. The Henderson boy, eager to share gossip, told Clara about the increased patrol activity, the marshals asking questions about a wounded outlaw who'd killed 2 deputies in a gunfight 15 miles south. "They say he's part of the Morrison gang," the boy confided, eyes wide with excitement. "Dangerous as they come. Ma says to keep your rifle handy, Mrs. Boone." Clara managed appropriate concern, promised to be careful, and sent the boy on his way with a jar of preserves for his mother. Then she walked slowly back to the barn where Elias waited in the shadows. "2 deputies," she said. It wasn't a question. "They didn't give me much choice." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Never do." Clara studied him. This man she'd saved, nursed back to health, shared her meager food with. Was she harboring a cold-blooded killer or a man trapped by circumstances? Perhaps both. Perhaps in this hard country, the distinction mattered less than she'd like to believe. "You'll need to leave soon," she said finally. "Tomorrow night. I'm healed enough." Neither mentioned that he was far from fully recovered, that hard riding would likely tear open wounds barely closed. But staying meant danger for them both, and they'd always known this arrangement was temporary. That last night, Clara found herself lingering in the barn longer than necessary. They talked more than usual careful conversation about inconsequential things. The best way to treat colic in horses, the signs of coming rain, how to mend leather that had dried and cracked, safe topics that skirted around the truths neither wanted to examine too closely. When Clara finally rose to leave, Elias caught her hand. His touch was gentle, calloused fingers barely grazing her skin, but it stopped her like a shot. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Clara looked down at their joined hands, hers work-roughened but small in his grasp, his marked by violence but capable of surprising gentleness. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different world, one where such hands might hold hers for reasons other than gratitude. Then she pulled away. "Try not to get shot again, mister. Kane. I'll do my best, Mrs. Boone. Tomorrow he would disappear into the darkness, and she would return to her solitary existence, pretending these strange days had never happened. But tonight, with the barn lamp casting golden light and the horses breathing softly in their stalls, Clara allowed herself this moment of connection with a man who'd shown her that even the hardest souls could still bleed, still hurt, still need the kindness of strangers. The morning would bring goodbye, but the morning was still hours away. The night Elias was supposed to leave, a fierce windstorm swept across the prairie, driving dust and debris against the walls of Clara's house. She lay in bed listening to the shutters rattle, knowing he would have to wait another day. Part of her felt relief at the delay, though she couldn't examine too closely why his departure weighed so heavy on her heart. In the morning, she found him standing by the barn door, watching the wind bend the grass in rippling waves. His color was better now, the gray pallor replaced by the weathered tan of a man who lived under open skies. He'd regained some of the weight fever had stolen, though his clothes still hung loose on his frame. "Storm's passing," he said without turning. "I'll ride out tonight." Clara set down the breakfast she'd brought. "Your wounds aren't ready for hard riding." "They'll have to be." He finally looked at her, and she saw resignation in those gray eyes. "Staying longer only puts you at risk." They'd had this conversation before, but now, with departure imminent, Clara found herself grasping for reasons to delay. "At least let me check the bandages one more time." He submitted to her examination without protest, sitting on a hay bale while she unwrapped the cloth from his ribs. The wound had closed, but was still tender, the new skin pink and fragile. She'd seen enough healing injuries to know that hard activity could tear it open again. "You'll need to keep this clean," she said, applying fresh salve. "And try not to— Annie." Clara's hands stilled. In all their days together, he'd never voluntarily mentioned the name he called out in fever dreams. "She's 6 years old," Elias continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Brown hair like her mother's, stubborn as a mule when she sets her mind to something." Clara resumed her work, sensing this was not a moment for questions. She tied off the new bandage and moved to check his shoulder. Her mother died when she was 2. Fever took her. His jaw tightened. "I tried to raise Annie myself, but this life—" He gestured vaguely at his gun belt. "It's no life for a child." "Where is she now?" Clara asked softly. "With her aunt in Colorado, good woman, married to a shopkeeper. Annie has a real bed, goes to school, wears clean dresses." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She writes me letters sometimes." "Well, her aunt writes them, but Annie tells her what to say." Clara felt her throat tighten. This hard man, this killer, was also a father who'd given up his daughter for her own good. "Do you see her?" "When I can. Not often enough." He caught Clara's hand as she finished with the bandage. "That's why I need to leave, Mrs. Boone. There's money on my head, and men looking to collect it. If they track me here—" "I understand." And she did, though understanding didn't ease the hollow feeling in her chest. That afternoon, Clara busied herself with chores while Elias prepared for departure. She watched from the kitchen window as he saddled his horse, every movement careful and deliberate. He'd cleaned his weapons, packed what few supplies she could spare, and studied the horizon like a man reading scripture. As evening approached, she made one last trip to the barn with food for his journey. She found him sitting on his bedroll, holding the small wooden horse he'd been carving. In the lamplight, she could see it was finely detailed, clearly made with patience and skill. "For Annie?" she asked. He nodded, turning the toy over in his hands. "I make one whenever I can. Have a whole box of them waiting to give her someday." He looked up at Clara. "Foolish, probably." "Not foolish." Clara sat down beside him, propriety forgotten in these last moments. "She'll treasure them." They sat in comfortable silence, the space between them charged with unspoken words. Finally, Elias tucked the wooden horse into his saddlebag and stood. "Time to go." Clara walked with him as he led his horse out of the barn. The evening was clear, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. A good night for traveling, if one ignored the danger waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. At the edge of the yard, Elias stopped and turned to face her. In the twilight, his scarred face looked younger, almost vulnerable. I won't forget what you did for me." "Just stay alive," Clara said, surprised by the roughness in her voice. "For Annie." "For Annie," he agreed. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You're a good woman, Clara Boone. Your husband was a lucky man." Before she could respond, he mounted his horse with only a slight grimace of pain. Clara wanted to call out, to say something that would make this parting easier, but no words came. Instead, she raised her hand in farewell as he touched his hat brim and rode into the gathering darkness. She stood there long after the sound of hoofbeats faded, until the chill night air drove her inside. The house felt emptier than it had in years, the silence more complete. She moved through her evening routine mechanically, trying not to think about a wounded outlaw riding through hostile territory, or a little girl in Colorado waiting for letters from her father. 3 days passed before Clara could bring herself to clear out the corner of the barn where Elias had stayed. She found things he'd left behind: a worn deck of cards, a whetstone, the bloody shirt she'd cut from him that first night. She burned the shirt but kept the other items, telling herself they might be useful. Life returned to its previous rhythm, but something had shifted. The loneliness that had been her constant companion now had a different quality, tinged with the memory of gray eyes and careful conversation. She caught herself listening for sounds from the barn, making enough food for 2 before remembering she was alone again. A week after Elias left, young Tom Henderson rode over with news from town. "Did you hear, Mrs. Boone? They caught up with that outlaw over in Mason County. Big shootout, they say." Clara's hands clenched in her apron. "Did they? Was he?" "Oh, he got away, killed 2 more deputies and disappeared into the Badlands." Tom's eyes shone with the excitement of distant violence. "They say he's heading south to Mexico." Relief flooded through her so strongly she had to sit down. Tom, misreading her reaction, quickly assured her that the danger was past, that she was safe now. Clara managed to thank him and send him on his way, her mind racing. South to Mexico, the opposite direction from Colorado and Annie. That night, she allowed herself to imagine Elias somewhere under the same stars, perhaps making another wooden horse by a lonely campfire. She wondered if he thought of the widow who'd saved his life, if he remembered their conversations in the barn's golden lamplight. 2 months later, a letter arrived with her monthly supplies from town. Her name was written in careful, unfamiliar script on an envelope with no return address. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper and 10 $20 bills. The letter was brief. "Mrs. Boone, this is partial payment for a debt that can never be fully repaid. The rest will come when I can manage it safely. Tell no one about this money. Use it for whatever you need, fixing the roof, buying better horses, getting through the winter. You've earned it and more." Annie liked the wooden horse. She says to tell the nice lady thank you, though she doesn't know she's thanking you for more than she can understand. Stay safe, E.K. Clara read the letter 3 times before carefully burning it in the stove. The money she hid behind the loose board with her savings, though it was more than she'd seen in her life. She wouldn't spend it right away. That would raise questions. But knowing it was there eased a weight she'd carried since Samuel's death. That night, she stood by Samuel's grave and told him about the strange weeks that had passed, about the choice she'd made to save a man others would condemn, about the father hidden beneath the outlaw's reputation, about the money that would keep their land safe for another year. "I think you would understand," she whispered to the wooden marker. "You always saw the good in people, even when it was buried deep." The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, and for a moment Clara could almost believe it was Samuel's voice, giving his blessing to a widow who'd found strength she didn't know she possessed, and glimpsed a connection she hadn't expected to feel again. Somewhere to the south, a dangerous man carried the memory of her kindness. Somewhere to the north, a little girl played with a wooden horse, unaware that a stranger's mercy had kept her father alive to carve it. And here on the prairie, Clara Boone faced another night alone, but no longer quite as lonely as before. The autumn rain drummed against Clara's roof as she sat mending a torn harness by lamplight. 6 months had passed since Elias Kane had ridden into the darkness. 6 months of ordinary days that somehow felt less ordinary with the memory of those strange weeks lingering like smoke. She'd used some of his money to repair the roof and buy a new plow, careful to space the purchases so as not to arouse suspicion. A knock at her door made her jump, the harness falling from her lap. It was past 9 o'clock, too late for social calls. Clara reached for the rifle beside the door before calling out, "Who's there? Mrs. Boone?" The voice was familiar but strained. "It's Elias Kane. I need help." Clara's heart hammered as she unbarred the door. He stood on her porch, one hand braced against the doorframe, rain streaming from his hat. Even in the poor light, she could see he was hurt again. Not shot this time, but his left arm hung at an awkward angle, and dark bruises marked his face. "Horse through me," he said before she could ask. "About 2 miles back. Think the shoulder's dislocated." Without hesitation, Clara pulled him inside. He was shivering, soaked through, and she could smell whiskey on him. Not drunk, but like he'd used it for pain. She guided him to a chair by the stove and lit more lamps to examine his injuries. "Why did you come back here?" she asked, helping him out of his wet coat. The movement made him hiss in pain. "Nowhere else to go," he admitted through clenched teeth. "Can't ride into any town looking like this. Can't trust anyone else." Clara examined his shoulder with gentle fingers. Definitely dislocated. She'd seen it before in ranch hands who'd taken bad falls. "I need to put this back in place. It's going to hurt. Just do it." She positioned herself behind him, gripping his arm the way Samuel had taught her. "On 3. 1, 2. She yanked on 2, feeling the joint slip back into place with an audible pop. Elias let out a strangled groan, but didn't cry out. While he recovered, Clara studied him more closely. The past months had not been kind. He was thinner, new lines etched around his eyes, and there was a weariness in his posture that spoke of too many nights sleeping rough and days looking over his shoulder. "There's stew on the stove," she said. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday. Maybe the day before." Clara heated the stew and cut thick slices of bread, watching him eat with a single-minded focus. When he'd finished, she asked, "What really happened?" Elias leaned back in the chair, cradling his injured arm. "Got word that Annie was sick, real sick. Tried to get to Colorado but ran into trouble near the border. Law's tighter now. They've got my description posted in every town from here to Denver. Is she—" "Don't know." The words came out raw. "Her aunt sent a letter to a friend of mine, said the fever was bad. That was 3 weeks ago." Clara felt the weight of his anguish, a father unable to reach his sick child. You can't help her if you're dead or captured. Can't help her sitting here either. He rubbed his face with his good hand. "I've got money hidden in Colorado, enough to pay for a real doctor, medicine, whatever she needs. But I can't get to it." They sat in silence, the rain beating harder against the windows. Clara made a decision that surprised her even as the words left her mouth. "I could go." Elias's head snapped up. "What?" "I could go to Colorado. A widow traveling alone isn't unusual. I could bring the money to your daughter, make sure she gets proper care." "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Where's the money hidden?" He studied her for a long moment, and she saw him wrestling with trust, desperation, and hope. Finally, he said, "There's an old miner's shack about 5 miles north of Cripple Creek. Loose floorboard under the back window. But Clara, this is dangerous. If anyone connects you to me—" "They won't." She stood, her mind already working through the logistics. "I'll tell people I'm visiting my cousin. Tom Henderson can look after the stock for a few weeks." "Why?" Elias asked, echoing his question from months ago. "Why would you do this?" Clara thought of her own childlessness, of the wooden horse he'd carved with such care, of a little girl who might be dying while her father was hunted like an animal. "Because no child should suffer for their father's choices. Because I can." They spent the next hour planning. Elias drew a rough map, described the shack and its surroundings, told her how to find his daughter's aunt in Colorado Springs. He gave her a letter to deliver, sealed and addressed simply to Annie. "Her aunt is Mrs. Margaret Palmer," he said. "Good woman, but careful. She knows what I am, doesn't approve, but she loves Annie. Tell her—" He paused, struggling. "Tell her I'm trying to be better, for Annie." As the night wore on, the storm began to ease. Elias would need to leave before dawn, find somewhere else to hole up while Clara made the journey. She fashioned a sling for his arm and packed food for him to take. "There's something else," he said as she worked. "Something I should have told you before." Clara waited, sensing this was difficult for him. "Annie isn't her real name. It's what I call her, what her mother called her, but Margaret had her baptized as Elizabeth. Elizabeth Mary Palmer, to give her a clean start." His voice turned bitter. "Can't have her carrying the Kane name, not with what it means." "She's still your daughter," Clara said softly. "A name doesn't change that." "Maybe not, but it might give her a chance at a better life." He stood, testing his balance. "I should go." At the door, he turned back. "If something happens, if I don't—" "You'll see her again," Clara interrupted. "I'll make sure she knows you're thinking of her." He reached out with his good hand, cupping her face as he had that night months ago. This time, Clara didn't pull away. "I don't deserve the help you've given me." "Probably not," she agreed, allowing herself a small smile. "But you're getting it anyway." Something shifted in his expression, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. The air between them grew charged, heavy with possibility. Then he stepped back, touching his hat brim in that familiar gesture. "Safe travels, Clara Boone. Stay alive, Elias Kane." He disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, and Clara was left with the echo of rain and the weight of a promise. In a few hours, she would begin preparing for a journey that would take her far from her safe, lonely existence. She would carry money that wasn't hers to a child she'd never met, all for a man who lived outside the law but had somehow found a place inside her guarded heart. As she cleaned up the evidence of his visit, the muddy boot prints, the dishes, the medical supplies, Clara thought about the strange turns life could take. A year ago, she'd been merely surviving, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. Now she was about to embark on a dangerous mission that could see her arrested or worse. But there was purpose in it, meaning beyond her own survival. A little girl named Annie or Elizabeth needed help, and Clara was in a position to provide it. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd married Samuel and come west with dreams of children and prosperity. But it was a life nonetheless, unexpected and dangerous, and more vital than anything she'd known since Samuel's death. The sun rose over the prairie, painting the wet grass gold and crimson. Clara stood at her window, watching the light spread across the land she'd fought so hard to keep. In a week, she would lock this door and ride toward Colorado, toward a sick child and an uncertain future. For the first time in 3 years, Clara Boone felt truly alive. She pressed her fingers to her cheek where Elias had touched her, allowing herself one moment of foolish hope. Then she turned from the window and began to plan. There was much to do before she could leave, arrangements to make, lies to perfect. But first, she needed to write her own letter, one that might never be delivered but needed to be written all the same. Sitting at her table, she picked up her pen and began. "Dear Elias, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong." Clara had been gone 3 weeks when the bounty hunters arrived in Dusty Hollow. She heard about it later from Tom Henderson, who'd ridden hard to Colorado Springs to warn her, fearing the worst. But that came after she'd found the money, after she'd met Annie, after everything had changed. The journey to Colorado had been uneventful, even pleasant at times. Clara had forgotten the simple joy of seeing new landscapes, of staying in towns where no one knew her as the Widow Boone. She'd found Elias's hidden cash easily enough, her heart pounding as she pried up the floorboard to reveal a leather satchel containing more money than she'd ever seen, enough to pay for doctors, medicine, and years of care if needed. Margaret Palmer lived in a modest frame house on the respectable side of Colorado Springs. When Clara knocked, a thin woman with graying hair and tired eyes answered, suspicion clear on her face, until Clara mentioned Elias's name. "He sent you?" Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. "Is he? He's alive," Clara assured her. "But he couldn't come himself. He asked me to help with Annie's care." Margaret's rigid posture sagged with relief. "Come in, please. She's been asking for him in her fever." The house was clean but sparse. Everything speaking of genteel poverty barely held at bay. Margaret led Clara to a back bedroom where a small girl lay propped against pillows, her face flushed with fever, but her eyes, gray like her father's, alert and watchful. "Annie," Margaret said softly, "this is Mrs. Boone. She's a friend of your papa's." The child studied Clara with that familiar, intense gaze. "Papa doesn't have friends," she said matter-of-factly, her voice hoarse but clear. "Well, he has at least one," Clara replied, charmed despite the circumstances. She could see Elias in the girl's stubborn chin, the way she held herself even in illness. Over the next days, Clara threw herself into helping care for Annie. The money paid for a proper doctor who diagnosed pneumonia, but said the worst had passed. Medicine, good food, and clean linens worked their magic, and slowly the child began to improve. Clara found herself drawn to Annie's spirit. The girl was indeed stubborn as a mule, just as Elias had said, but also bright and curious about everything. "Why are you helping us?" Annie asked one afternoon as Clara read to her from a book of fairy tales. Clara marked her place carefully. "Your papa helped me once. Friends do that for each other." "Did he save you from bad men?" The question was so earnest, so trusting, that Clara's heart ached. What did this child know of her father's life? What stories had she built in her imagination? "In a way," Clara said finally, "he reminded me that there's still kindness in the world, even in unexpected places." Annie seemed to consider this. "Aunt Margaret says Papa can't visit because he has important work far away, but I think it's because he's in trouble." Clara chose her words carefully. "Your Papa loves you very much. If he could be here, nothing would keep him away." "I know." Annie's small hand found Clara's. "Will you tell him I'm being good? That I'm going to school and learning my letters? I'll make sure he knows." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Boone, might I speak with you?" In the kitchen, Margaret poured tea with hands that shook slightly. "I know who you really are," she said without preamble. "Or rather, I can guess. You're the widow who took Elias in when he was shot." Clara didn't deny it. "How did you know?" "He wrote about you, not in detail, but enough. Said if anything happened to him, you might be the only person who'd care enough to check on Annie." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I care for that child like my own, but I can't pretend I have any love for her father." "He's trying to be better," Clara said, remembering Elias's words. "For her. Too little, too late." Margaret set down her cup sharply. "Do you know what it's like, raising a child whose father is hunted? The lies I have to tell, the fear every time someone knocks at the door?" Clara thought of her own recent weeks of deception. "I'm beginning to understand." "Are you?" Margaret leaned forward. "Tell me, Mrs. Boone, are you in love with him?" The question hit like cold water. That's not..." "Because if you are, you need to understand what that means. It means never having peace. It means teaching Annie to lie about her name, her family. It means knowing that any day someone might come to your door with news that he's finally dead." Clara met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I know what it means to lose someone to violence. I've already paid that price once." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Then you're a fool to risk paying it again." That night, Clara lay awake in her boarding house room, Margaret's words echoing in her mind. Was she in love with Elias Kane? The thought seemed absurd. They'd spent only weeks together, most of it with him injured and her terrified of discovery. But she couldn't deny the pull she felt, the way her heart had lifted when he'd appeared at her door again. The next morning brought Tom Henderson and his dire news. "Mrs. Boone, thank the Lord I found you. There's been trouble back home. Men came looking for you, rough sorts, asking questions about who you might have helped." Clara's blood ran cold. "Bounty hunters?" That's what folks figured. Sheriff ran them off, but they were powerful interested in your place. Said they'd tracked their man that far and wondered if you'd seen anything. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, ma'am. Nobody in Dusty Hollow said nothing about nothing." Tom's young face was earnest. "We look after our own, but I thought you should know. It might not be safe to come back just yet." Clara thanked him, sent him back with assurances that she was fine, and tried to think. If bounty hunters had tracked Elias to her farm, it was only a matter of time before they made the connection. She needed to warn him, but how? He could be anywhere by now. She returned to the Palmer house to find Annie much improved, sitting up and playing with a collection of wooden horses. The child's face lit up when Clara entered. "Look, Mrs. Boone, Papa made these for me. Aunt Margaret has been keeping them, and now I'm well enough to play properly." Clara picked up one of the horses, recognizing Elias's careful work. There were over a dozen, each slightly different, carved with patient love. "They're beautiful, sweetheart. This one's my favorite." Annie held up a mare with a flowing mane. "I named her Clara." "Clara? After you?" The child's expression was matter-of-fact. "Papa says we should name things after people who are kind to us, so we remember." Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Annie, time for your medicine." As the child grimaced but obediently took the spoonful of tonic, Margaret caught Clara's eye. "Might I speak with you again?" This time, Margaret led her to the front porch. "There was a man here this morning asking questions. Rough-looking fellow, said he was looking for a friend who might have passed through. Described someone who sounded very much like Elias." Clara's heart sank. "What did you tell him?" "That I run a respectable house and don't associate with drifters." Margaret's smile was thin. "But he'll be back. They always come back." "I should leave," Clara said. "My presence here only puts you in danger. Perhaps it's time to stop running." Margaret studied her. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Elias trying to be better. Maybe I've been too hard on him. Lord knows that child loves him despite everything." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you know how to reach him, maybe it's time he knew the truth. The bounty on his head isn't going away. Annie isn't going to stop loving him. And you—" She shook her head. "You've already chosen your path, haven't you?" That night, Clara wrote 2 letters. The first was to Elias, care of the friend he'd mentioned, telling him about the bounty hunters and warning him to stay away. The second was to Sheriff Watson in Dusty Hollow, asking about the legal process for clearing someone's name. As she sealed the letters, Clara thought about the choices that had led her here. The moment she'd decided to help a wounded stranger. The night she'd promised to help his daughter. The gradual accumulation of small decisions that had changed her from a grieving widow to, what? A woman in love with an outlaw? A fool risking everything for a chance at something she couldn't even name? Through the boarding house window, she could see the mountains rising in the distance, snow-capped and eternal. Somewhere out there, Elias Kane was running, always running. But maybe Margaret was right. Maybe it was time to stop running and face whatever came next. Clara touched the pocket where she kept Elias's letter to Annie, still undelivered. Tomorrow she would give it to the child, would watch those gray eyes light up at words from her father, and then she would wait. For news. For Elias himself. For whatever fate had in store. The world was dangerous and uncertain, full of hard men and harder choices. But there was also a little girl named Annie who carved horses and named them after kind people. There was also the memory of gentle hands and grateful eyes, of connection forged in unlikely circumstances. Clara Boone had come to Colorado to deliver money and help a sick child. But she'd found something more, a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to hope despite the odds. Whether that made her brave or foolish remained to be seen. But for tonight, with her letters written and her course set, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a future worth fighting for. The gunfire erupted just as Clara was preparing to leave Colorado Springs. She'd been packing her few belongings when the shooting started, sharp cracks that echoed off the buildings, followed by shouts and the thunder of running horses. From her boarding house window, she saw men scattering in the street, diving for cover as 2 groups exchanged fire near the livery stable. Her heart knew before her mind accepted it. Elias was here. Against all warnings, despite the danger, he'd come for his daughter. Clara grabbed her shawl and rushed downstairs, pushing through the gathered crowd. The shooting had stopped, but tension still crackled in the air. Near the stable, she saw bodies on the ground and lawmen clustering around them. But no Elias. "What happened?" she asked a woman beside her. "Bounty hunters cornered some outlaw. There was a fight. Awful thing. Right in broad daylight." The woman clutched her parcels tighter. "They say he got away, but he's hurt bad. Left a trail of blood heading toward the residential streets." Clara's mind raced. The residential streets toward Margaret's house, toward Annie. She ran, propriety forgotten, her boots slipping on the muddy streets. Other people were running too, some toward the excitement, others away from it. Clara pushed through them all, her only thought to reach the Palmer house before the law did. She found Elias collapsed in Margaret's back garden, propped against the fence with his gun still in his hand. Blood soaked his shirt from at least 2 wounds, and his face was gray with pain and blood loss. Margaret stood in her doorway. Annie clutched behind her, both frozen with shock. "Get inside," Clara ordered, taking charge. "Margaret, keep Annie away from the windows. Now!" The older woman jerked into action, pulling the protesting child inside. Clara knelt beside Elias, her hands already assessing his injuries. "You fool," she whispered. "You absolute fool." His eyes focused on her with effort. Had to see her. Got your letter. Couldn't stay away. Save your strength." Clara pressed her shawl against the worst wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "We need to get you inside." "No." His hand caught hers, surprisingly strong. "Won't bring this to their door. Not again." "Then where?" Clara's mind worked frantically. The law would be searching house by house soon. The boarding house was too public. Then she remembered. The old root cellar behind Margaret's garden, half hidden by overgrown vines. Working together, with Elias trying to help despite his injuries, they managed to get him into the cellar. It was damp and dark, barely big enough for a man to lie down, but it would hide him for now. Clara ran back to the house for supplies, water, bandages, Margaret's medical kit. "Is he?" Margaret started. "Alive, barely." Clara gathered what she needed. "I need you to keep Annie inside, no matter what she hears. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, her face pale but determined. She already saw him through the window. She knows he's hurt. "Then tell her I'm helping him. Tell her—" Clara paused, then said firmly, "Tell her everything will be all right." Back in the cellar, Clara worked by the light of a single candle. The wounds were bad. One bullet still lodged in his shoulder, another having passed through his side. She'd gotten better at this, she realized grimly, her hands steady as she cleaned and bandaged. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering Annie's name. Once, he gripped Clara's hand and said clearly, "Should have stayed away. Should have protected you both." "Hush," Clara murmured, wiping sweat from his brow. "Rest now." The search parties came as the sun was setting. Clara heard them in the alley, saw their lanterns bobbing past the garden fence. She held her breath, one hand on Elias's chest to keep him quiet if he stirred. The searchers moved on, and she allowed herself a moment of relief. But this was temporary. Come morning, they'd search more thoroughly, and Elias couldn't stay in the cellar. He needed proper care, or he'd die from his wounds. Clara made her decision. She climbed out of the cellar and went to find Margaret, who was reading to Annie in the parlor, trying to maintain normalcy. "I need a wagon," Clara said quietly, "and a reason to leave town tonight." Margaret understood immediately. "My cousin in Denver has been ill. I received word this afternoon that she's taken a turn for the worse." She met Clara's eyes. "You could accompany me, help with the nursing." "What about—" Clara glanced at Annie. "She comes with us. It's not safe here anymore." Margaret's voice was firm. "I've been fooling myself, thinking we could stay hidden forever. It's time to go." They worked quickly. Margaret packed essentials while Clara prepared the wagon, padding the bed with blankets and straw. The hardest part was moving Elias. He was barely conscious, dead weight that took both women to lift. They covered him with a tarp and household goods, making it look like a normal moving load. Annie watched it all with those gray eyes that missed nothing. When they were ready to leave, she tugged on Clara's sleeve. "Is Papa going to die?" Clara knelt to the child's level. "I'm going to do everything I can to help him, but he needs you to be brave and quiet. Can you do that?" Annie nodded solemnly. "I can be brave. Papa says I'm the bravest girl in Colorado." They left as the moon rose, Clara driving while Margaret sat with Annie in the back, near where Elias lay hidden. The road out of Colorado Springs was mercifully empty, most folks inside for the night. Clara's hands were white-knuckled on the reins, expecting shouts and gunfire at any moment. 5 miles out, Elias stirred. Clara heard him trying to speak and pulled the wagon off the road into a copse of trees. She climbed into the back, finding him awake and lucid despite the pain. "Annie," he whispered. "I'm here, Papa." The child scrambled forward before Margaret could stop her, her small hand finding his. "Mrs. Boone is taking us somewhere safe." In the moonlight, Clara saw tears track down Elias's weathered face. "My brave girl, I'm so sorry for everything." "Don't be sorry, just get better." Annie's voice was fierce with love and determination. "We need you." Elias's eyes found Clara. "Both of you, in danger because of me." "We're in this together now," Clara said firmly. "All of us." They traveled through the night, stopping only to water the horses and check Elias's wounds. By dawn, they'd reached an abandoned homestead Clara remembered from her journey to Colorado Springs. It wasn't much, a 2-room cabin with a leaking roof, but it was shelter. Over the next days, Clara fought for Elias's life. The bullet in his shoulder had to come out, a brutal procedure that left him unconscious for hours. Infection set in, bringing fever that had him thrashing and calling out. Annie refused to leave his side, holding his hand and talking to him in a steady stream of childhood observations. "Remember when you taught me to whistle, Papa? I can do it real good now. Want to hear? Remember the story about the wild horses? You said someday we'd see them together. Mrs. Boone makes good soup, almost as good as Mama used to make. You'd like it if you'd wake up and try some." Margaret, despite her earlier harsh words about Elias, worked tirelessly alongside Clara. "He's her father," she said simply when Clara expressed surprise. "Whatever else he is, he's that first." On the 4th night, the fever broke. Elias opened clear eyes to find Clara dozing in a chair beside him, Annie curled against his good side, and Margaret keeping watch by the window. "Quite a gathering," he rasped. Clara jerked awake. "You're back." "Seems so." He looked down at Annie, his expression soft, "though I'm not sure I deserve to be." "Papa!" Annie threw her arms around him, careful of his wounds. "I knew you'd get better. I told Mrs. Boone you were too stubborn to die." Over the child's head, Elias met Clara's eyes. There was something new there, beyond gratitude or attraction. Something deeper and more dangerous than either of them had allowed before. Later, when Annie had fallen asleep and Margaret was resting, Elias spoke the words Clara had been both dreading and hoping to hear. "I can't keep running, can't keep putting her through this." His voice was rough with emotion. "There's a federal marshal in Denver, Marcus Webb. He's straight as they come. If I turn myself in, testify about the Morrison gang's operations, maybe I can make a deal." "Prison?" Clara asked quietly. "Probably, but Annie would be safe, free to use her real name, go to school without looking over her shoulder." He paused, then added, "And you could go home, back to your life." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What if that's not the life I want anymore?" Elias reached out with his good hand, touching her face with infinite gentleness. "Clara Boone, you've already given more than anyone has a right to ask. I won't have you waiting for a man who might spend the next 10 years behind bars." "That's not your choice to make," Clara said firmly. "Besides, someone needs to help Margaret raise that stubborn daughter of yours. Make sure she learns to be brave and kind and strong, like her father, when he lets himself be." Elias closed his eyes, overwhelmed. When he opened them again, there was hope there, fragile but real. Could you really? Clara leaned down and kissed him, soft and sure. It was a promise and a beginning, sealed in a broken-down cabin with danger still circling close. When she pulled back, she said, "I've made my choice, Elias Kane. Question is, what's yours?" He looked at his sleeping daughter, at Margaret keeping her faithful watch, at Clara with her steady courage. "I choose them," he said simply. "I choose trying. I choose whatever gives Annie a chance at a real life, even if it means—" "Then we go to Denver," Clara said. "Together. And whatever comes after, we face it the same way." Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind rattled the cabin's loose boards. But inside, for this moment, there was warmth and hope and the possibility of redemption. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing in this hard country ever was. But with Annie's hand in his and Clara beside him, Elias Kane was ready to stop running and start building something worth keeping. The morning would bring new challenges, the journey to Denver and an uncertain future. But tonight they were together, and that was enough. That was everything. 5 years had passed since that night in the broken-down cabin. Clara stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. The land stretched before her, no longer the lonely expanse of her widowhood, but a place transformed by love and hard work into something approaching prosperity. "Mama Clara, look what I can do," Annie called from the corral, standing atop her horse with arms outstretched. At 11, she was fearless as ever, though Clara had managed to temper some of her wilder impulses with gentle guidance. "Elizabeth Mary Kane, you get down from there before you break your neck," Clara called back, using the child's full name in the way mothers did when worried. Annie grinned and dropped back into the saddle, riding over to the fence. "Papa says you used to be scared of everything when he first met you." "Your papa tells tales," Clara said, though her smile took any sting from the words. "And speaking of your papa, where is he?" "In the barn with Uncle Marcus. They're looking at that new colt again." Clara shook her head fondly. Marcus Webb, the federal marshal who'd become their unlikely ally, visited regularly now. His testimony, combined with Elias's cooperation in bringing down the Morrison gang, had resulted in a lighter sentence than anyone had dared hope 2 years in prison, with early release for good behavior. Elias had served 18 months, and every day of it had been worth it for the life they'd built since. She walked to the barn, finding the two men deep in discussion about bloodlines and training methods. Elias looked up as she entered, his face creasing into the smile that still made her heart skip. The years had been kind to him. Regular meals and honest work had filled out his frame, and while his hair showed silver at the temples, he carried himself with a peace that had been absent in their early days. "Clara," Marcus tipped his hat. "I was just telling Elias he ought to consider breeding this colt. Finest horse flesh I've seen in years." "Don't encourage him," Clara said. "He's already planning to expand the stable again." "A man needs ambitions," Elias said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Besides, someone has to keep you from working yourself to death in that garden of yours." It was true that Clara had thrown herself into making their land bloom. The vegetable garden that had once struggled to survive now flourished, providing enough to sell at market along with their preserves. Margaret, who lived with them now, had proved gifted at turning their produce into jellies and pickles that brought good prices in town. "Letter came while you were out here," Clara said, producing an envelope from her apron pocket. "From the territorial governor." Elias tensed slightly. Old habits died hard, but relaxed when he saw her smile. "Good news? Read it yourself." He opened the letter, Marcus reading over his shoulder. Both men's eyebrows rose as they absorbed the contents. "A full pardon?" Marcus whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. Excuse my language, Clara. The governor says your assistance was instrumental in breaking up the gang network," Clara said. "That your rehabilitation serves as an example of justice tempered with mercy." Elias stared at the paper, emotion working across his face. A full pardon meant complete freedom. No more checking in with marshals, no more restrictions on travel, no more shadow hanging over Annie's future. "I need to tell Annie," he said finally, voice rough. They found her in the kitchen with Margaret, both of them flour-dusted from baking. When Elias explained about the pardon, Annie launched herself at him with a whoop of joy. "Does this mean we can travel to San Francisco like you promised? Can we see the ocean?" "We can go anywhere you want, little bird," Elias said, holding her tight. Margaret wiped her eyes with her apron. "Lord knows you've earned it. Both of you." That evening they held an impromptu celebration. Marcus stayed for dinner, regaling them with stories from his latest adventures. Margaret outdid herself with the meal and even convinced Elias to bring out his fiddle, something he only did when truly content. As music filled their home, Clara found herself thinking back to that first night when she discovered a wounded outlaw by her barn. She couldn't have imagined then where that act of mercy would lead. To love, to family, to a life richer than any she dared dream. Later, after Marcus had left and Margaret had retired, Clara and Elias sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the vast sky. Annie had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder, worn out from excitement. "I should put her to bed," Elias said softly, but made no move to rise. "Let her be," Clara said. "She's happy." "Are you?" He turned to look at her. Happy, I mean. This isn't the life you planned when you married Samuel. Clara considered the question. No, it isn't, she admitted. It's better. Even with everything we went through, the danger, the separation, the uncertainty, especially because of all that. Clara took his free hand, threading their fingers together. It taught me that I'm stronger than I knew. That love isn't just about the easy times. It's about choosing each other even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Elias brought her hand to his lips. I still don't deserve you. Probably not, Clara agreed, echoing their old exchange. But you're stuck with me anyway. Annie stirred, mumbling something about horses. Elias stood carefully, cradling her against his chest. Come on, little bird. Time for bed. Clara followed them inside, pausing to look back at the land that had once seemed so empty. Now it was full of horses in the pasture, gardens ready for harvest, a house that rang with laughter and music, full of life in all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality. As she turned to go inside, a coyote howled in the distance. Not mournful now, but wild and free. Clara smiled and closed the door, going to join her family. The morning would bring new challenges, as mornings always did. But tonight, in this house built on second chances and stubborn hope, all was well. The widow who'd saved an outlaw had found her own salvation in return. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. That love could bloom even in the harshest ground. That redemption was possible for those brave enough to claim it. And that sometimes the very thing that seems like ending is actually just the beginning. Years from now, Annie would tell her own children about their grandfather who'd been lost but found his way home, and their grandmother who'd been brave enough to light a lamp in the darkness. She'd tell them about Aunt Margaret who'd raised her when times were hard, and Uncle Marcus, who proved that even lawmen could be friends. But mostly, she'd tell them about love, the kind that endures and transforms, that sees past scarred faces and wounded souls to the truth beneath. The kind that builds families from broken pieces and makes them whole. And somewhere in that telling, the legend would become truth and the truth would become legend, until no one could say where one ended and the other began, which was, perhaps, as it should be in a land built on stories and dreams, where a widow's mercy could change the course of lives, and an outlaw's love could build a legacy worth keeping. Clara had learned long ago that the West was a hard country that demanded everything and promised nothing. But sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, it gave back more than you ever dared imagine. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Clara and Elias's journey. What touched your heart most about their story?